name is Michelle Avalos, and I am the Director of Operations at Impact Hub Houston. I'll be helping to facilitate today's session on the back end. For those of you who are not familiar with Impact Hub Houston, we're a locally rooted, globally connected network of change makers, social entrepreneurs, and impact supporters. We believe that Houston can be a role model for how the world solves its most pressing issues, and I genuinely believe that this can be possible. I see our community stepping up every day and championing for change, and I'm just really excited to be part of this team. This core conversation series is our way of helping to raise awareness, understanding, and action for the issues that profoundly impact our community. We launched this series in the days leading up to Juneteenth. And if you missed the If Not Us, Then Who, If Not Now, Then When session with our board chair, Philip Yates, you can actually catch the recap and the replay on our website or on our YouTube channel. So on to today's discussion. We are talking on the theme of how to talk about race. And we have two very powerful women that are going to be leading this discussion and helping us learn on how we can best have those conversations moving forward. And so we're very excited to have as our special guest, Ms. Joy Hutton, who is our founder of Joy of Consulting and On the Go Glam and like 20 other things. And I love it. Awesome. And moderating our session will be Grace Rodriguez, our CEO and Executive Director. And so with further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass the floor over to you ladies to take it from here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. So I want to give some context to this conversation by reading something. One of the reasons why this conversation with Joy is really important today was the idea of how important language is. Recently, it's funny, I shared news about Amy Cooper being held accountable for calling the police on Christian Cooper in Central Park. And I was accused of being politically correct, of trying to be politically correct. And it made me think about this idea of political correctness and how some people see it as you're saying things because you want to score virtue points versus there's a real impact of language. The idea of politicizing language goes back to like the Southern strategy when it comes to race, goes back to the Southern strategy of the 1960s and dog whistle politics. And dog whistle politics is the use of coded or suggestive language in politics to garner support from a wider audience for a candidate. And it serves the purpose of attracting the intended political audience without offending other people. So to give you a better idea of what that is, coded language describes phrases that are targeted so often at a specific group that eventually the circumstances are blended into the phrase's meaning. And Ian Haney Lopez, who actually wrote the book, Dog Whistle Politics, explained that current racial code operates by appealing to deep-seated stereotypes of groups that are perceived as threatening. It allows people to say, hey, I'm just criticizing the behavior, not criticizing a racially defined group. I'm not racist, right? So generally, coded language is used against a group that threatens traditional power structures, which in America, those power structures are predominantly white, male, heterosexual, cisgender, and Christian. And these terms, this kind of coded language, can allow people to express the same fears in ways that aren't formally offensive and are commonly used to manipulate racial fears, ethnic resentments, xenophobia, and bigotry against people of color, ethnic minorities, women, LGBTQ people, and religious groups. And so, having that kind of context in mind as we move forward through this discussion, I want you to think about and ask questions and share your experiences too in the chat about what kind of language you might have experienced or might have been used against you, or Joy will talk a little bit about microaggressions, but these things that people say but don't necessarily understand whether intentional or not, intentionally harmful or not intentionally harmful, that are coded, right? Where there's racism or some kind of stereotype or bigotry coded into it. So taking a step back, Joy, thank you for joining us. I want to give you some space to introduce yourself and share how you and your business have been doing since all of these different crises have hit.
Yes, so I'm in two very different spaces, and well, really three. I have my management consulting firm, and we do organizational development. And basically, I like to say we manage the chaos of people and processes. And so, consulting is not number one on people's list, and business has slowed down, and clients have opted to obviously take care of their own businesses and their families before paying Joy of consulting, but as things reopen, we're getting back on track. But I also have a beauty tech startup. So being in beauty and tech, having to navigate both of those industries was very new to me because I'm only a consumer of beauty products. I have no prior beauty experience. And, I've had to do a lot of research to make sure I'm staying ahead of the market and the trends and things that's happening. But basically, with salons and whatnot closing down during the pandemic, that affected us too, because we offer at-home beauty services. So if anybody's in need of hair, makeup, and nail services, instead of going to the salon, that's what we do. So we will be live actually in a couple of weeks, and I'm excited about that. We've been doing some beta testing and, just trying to get a feel for what people really, really want and what they need, because people are still scared. But we did have to shut down because we were supposed to launch at South by Southwest, and with everything being closed, that definitely impacted our business. So yeah, so it definitely affected me. I had to think of a lot of different ways to pivot, and like everyone else, just trying to survive during this time.
And speaking of surviving in this time, there's, in addition to COVID-19 and the coronavirus, there's also all of the Black Lives Matter movement, right? There's the protests and discussion about how there has been an ongoing aggression and violence towards people of color. And as for you, as both an entrepreneur, a consultant, well, actually many things, as Michelle was saying earlier, and as an HR expert, human resources expert, what have you seen regarding bias and racism in your work?
Yeah, one of the things is how people deal with discrimination in the workplace, whether as an employer or as a victim. And, if anyone has experienced racism in the workplace, I always like to say, well, if you did experience racism in the workplace, did you take action? And when I say take action, meaning did you notify an HR person? Did you talk to someone about it? Did you talk to a coworker? Or if you didn't take action, why? And a lot of people, most people, Black, Latino, most people of color did not take action because they were afraid. They were like, well, if I speak out, I might lose my job. And, so that means if they feel that way, that means that there is not a safe space being created for people to address racism and discrimination in the workplace. And even if you're a woman and you're not necessarily a person of color, if you feel like you've been discriminated against, how are you dealing with that? And so, I know it's a scary situation to speak up, but I was doing another talk on this, and I said, because of my personality type, I can't just sit back. I'm going to say something, and I'm going to take that risk. Now, everybody's not going to do that because they're like, well, I may have 3 kids to feed at home, but something has to be done. If we're not holding people accountable for their actions, the same behavior is going to happen. And the policies that are put in place in these handbooks or whatever, they're not there to protect you, or they're supposed to be there to protect you, but you're not holding the employer accountable for them to do that. So I think that we do have to speak out, but employers also need to create a safe space for their employees. So just with the whole Black Lives Matters, it's interesting how now people are kind of taking action, and some of it is because it's popular, it's trendy. Some of it is because employers are actually concerned. You look at a lot of the companies who are speaking out on the Black Lives Matter movement, but it's like, oh, well, we can get a new audience. It's not because they actually care. And I think we just need to be honest, because a lot of people felt like, well, as a company, if I'm a business owner, I don't know what I should say. I'm scared. I don't know what I should say. And if I say something, I'm going to, hurt somebody's feelings over here. I mean, at the end of the day, how you feel is how you feel. Say what you feel. You know, you take the risk. And if you speak out for a celebrity, you know, everybody wants to promote Popeye's fried chicken sandwich. Well, then why can't you promote in, you know, equal justice? You know, so I think that it's important for people not to do what's popular, but to do what's important and what matters, what really matters. And so that's why that word after Black Lives Matter is so important. It doesn't mean that no one else is relevant. It means that Black lives matter. And, you know, when people are saying, oh, well, all lives matter, it's not about that, because the people who are being killed right now are Black people. And it's not just in the last 3 months. This has been going on for centuries. So I think that, you know, when we talk about how to have these conversations, again, it's creating that safe space. And then also, like, I mean, the day after, when people came back to work that Monday after George Floyd was killed, people had to sit on Zoom calls at work, you know, with their teams. I mean, and imagine, like, people were holding back tears. People were holding back anger. People wanted to curse. And you have to be fully present. And this is just not after the George Floyd. We are living this every day. So it's important to be sensitive to the needs of others and try to understand, like, it's a matter of empathy. And there are people who just don't have high EQ, but that's another conversation. But having empathy, because you may not understand exactly what someone's lived experience is, but having a conversation, you know, I've had several conversations where people who are mad about, well, why do I have to explain this? Why do I have to tell people why I'm angry? But you do, because some people are oblivious, some people are ignorant, some people don't care. And so we have to have these conversations where there are teachable moments. Because if we don't, we rely on other people to do the work, and a lot of people won't do the work because it doesn't affect them. So I think that, you know, it's a lot of layers to it. And I know you have more questions, but I just kind of wanted to, creating a safe space is what's most important. And employers have to respect that, because especially now when we're stuck in the house and people can't, like, take a vacation, allow your employees to have mental health days, especially during this time. I saw someone posted an article and it was saying the tale of two quarantines. And for Black people, it's the tale of two quarantines. I mean, for everybody, it is. You're trying to survive a deadly virus and you're trying to survive being Black. Like, that's crazy.
Yeah, and those two things are intersecting really harshly right now, with the coronavirus disproportionately impacting Black people as well. You know, there's a lot of research around that, because a lot of Black people are essential workers, so they do have to be out there and are in danger. And then, you know, just different cultural issues. If you still want to go to church, you know, because Black people are, you know, strong faith, you still want to go to church, you still want to celebrate together. And it becomes such a very complex and nuanced conversation about why this is disproportionately impacting Black people specifically. The things that you were just saying, they really resonate with me, because, you know, going back to that politically correct, I feel like it's more about how are you being morally correct. It's not about politics. To me, it's about morals and ethics. And as you said, empathy. And how do you show that you really care about other people? I want to unpack a little bit about some of the things you're alluding to with the language that people are using, and why you think people don't speak up, and not just people who are experiencing the aggressions, but the people who are on the sidelines observing.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it is they're worried about what other people think. You know, I've had people say, well, I want to put something on social media, but I'm afraid of what people will think. And I'm like, who? Afraid of who? And it's their white counterparts. And I'm like, so you're concerned about them, but if you really care, you wouldn't be concerned about them. If you really care about this cause, it's not about what other people think. And I think too, there's so much pressure to post on social media. You don't have to post on social media. Having a conversation with a friend that you're concerned about, that's a step forward. Having, you know, educating yourself on Black history. We had to educate ourselves on white history in class. So educate yourselves on Black history, why we feel the way we do. This is not a 3-month problem. This is centuries of oppression that and systemic oppression that has kept people where they are, has kept a whole race in one particular position. So it's just like, educate yourself on why this is happening and why the problems need to be fixed. And we are not the ones that need to fix the problem. It's the people who got us in the problem, it got us here in the first place. You know, you brought a whole race of people to this country, and there's a whole layer of stuff with that, because, you know, as African Americans or Black Americans, we don't have a country necessarily to go back to. We're displaced people. And then we're here in the United States and we're displaced because of systemic oppression and institutionalized racism and all these different things. And you have classism, and, you know, it's so many things. And so I think that, you know, educating ourselves, and like I said, not feeling pressured to put something on social media if that's just not your comfort zone. But there are things that you can do. You know, some people were protesting, some people were donating, some people were, you know, joining organizations that supported specific causes. But most important, before you jump on a hashtag or jump on the bandwagon, know what you're actually getting behind and how you can take steps to do, you know, to fix the problem. And it's going to take a lot. It's going to take baby steps, but, you know, protests are great, but where we need to impact change is on the policy level and get people out of these seats, you know, get people in seats that can make a difference, and they're just not sitting there for the title or sitting there to do the things that are not helping us.
Yeah, I think, you know, I know we'll discuss later a little bit about allyship, but one of the things I'm looking at right now, there's a recent report from Pew Research, and they talk about how many Black and Asian Americans, which is interesting because we're having this conversation, say they have experienced discrimination amid the COVID-19 outbreak. And so 4 in 10 adults say, US adults say, it's become more common for people to express racist views towards both Black and Asian Americans during this. And you look at the language that that Trump is using. You know, people are talking about the China virus and how, well, we want to say where it came from. Well, you know, why is that important? And then, you know, the administration saying why they don't understand why, you know, Kung flu is not hate language. They see that as like, well, it's just a, you know, if you can't take it, you go back to where you came from, like you said, without understanding or accepting that people of color, you know, we're from this country, or this is the country we chose to, you know, pledge our allegiance to. And all of these aggressions of, I'm not racist, I don't see color, you know, if you just work hard enough, like all of these things, this kind of language actually polarizes people. As we were talking about how, you know, how can people, when we're talking about how can people help in terms of language and communication, I think about, if you're afraid of posting what your opinions are, you can always post what the data is. Right? Because there's so much misinformation that's happening online now. And, you know, all of this stuff that's happening with Facebook and algorithms. One of the things that I find really helpful is just sharing. If you see somebody post something that is hateful and wrong, then share data with them of how that shows that this is actually it. And maybe they get educated and maybe not. But at least the people who are following that conversation can see what facts are and what the data shows, versus just continuing to spiral down that road. So, you know, with that, what is some of the language that you have seen that you think is not helpful, and what language do you think can be helpful? What can replace those things, like I'm not racist, or all lives matter, or whataboutism?
Well, anything negative obviously is not productive, right? But I think again, it goes back to that education piece. Before you speak out on something, make sure you know the facts. Because I think with anything, like just how Blackout Tuesday was diluted because people were still posting hashtag Black Lives Matter, and it was diluting the information that people needed to access. Because the whole idea behind the Blackout Tuesday or hashtag the show must be paused was that anybody posting a black box was supposed to provide some information, you know, on how to support this the Black Lives Matter movement. But it was just a bunch of black boxes and no information. So people who were seeking information weren't able to get it because there was just black boxes everywhere. So I think understanding exactly what you're supporting, that's with anything. And so I think here's one thing, a piece of advice, you know, and when talking about this, not opening the conversation with, I have black friends too. You know, that's not, I mean, that's an example of a microaggression. You know, I don't care. Do I go around saying I have white friends? I have eight? No, I have friends. How can I support my friends? You know, and so, yes, please, let's just eliminate that from our language because we're people. You don't say I have gay friends too. Like we don't need to specify that. We're people. I am supporting my friend in this way. Here are some ways that you can get involved, you know, and I think too, instead of saying that I'm not racist. Okay, that's great. But if you're not racist, you still have to recognize your privilege in any situation. All of us have privilege. But as a white person saying I'm not racist, but you saying that, you just automatically let me know that you have demonstrated your white privilege by saying that. You are a part of a people that has oppressed another group of people. So, and I'm not saying that to say that you are a bad person or whatever. Like if someone who says that I'm racist, I'm a good person, that's great. But saying that statement, that's great, but we're still experiencing racism. And how are you changing the narrative? So again, like I'm willing to have a conversation with my colleagues. I'm willing to take a stance, and taking a stance doesn't have to be aggressive. You know, just like someone who will speak up for a child not parenting correctly, you know, it's taking a stance like, oh, I don't think that was the right way to go about that. Or have you thought about X? So for example, you know, with the protest or the latest incident, well, probably is not even the latest incident, but one of the latest incidents, Rayshard Brooks, where people were going on social media, well, he took the taser and blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's fine. If you have a strong opinion about that, but when you're talking to a group of people, again, that has been oppressed and you're having conversations about these sensitive topics, approaching it in a way where you're offering a different perspective, but not bashing it. So a way, if you disagree, just say, well, have you thought about this perspective? Like if someone tried to tase you, you know, it was reactionary. Instead of just saying, well, he was wrong, he shouldn't have grabbed the taser and blah, blah, blah. Okay, because that's just going to start a whole argument. And, you know, there are so many layers to that whole incident. So I think just offering a different perspective, even if you don't agree, instead of being very defensive, because I think that's a problem too. When you're talking about sensitive topics like this, it's very easy to be defensive.
It's also easy to distract, right? And which I'm doing right now. I'm sorry, but it's easy to get for somebody else who isn't focused on what the fundamental issue is, to distract you from your issue and say like, okay, now we're going to go on this tangent and argue about whether, you know, he was in the wrong or not, versus going back to the fundamental issue of police violence against Black people and whether Black people deserve to die without even going to trial. Right.
Right. And that's just, we have to exercise our judgment in situations too. So if you know that this is new for you on speaking out, process your feelings. Process your feelings about everything before you just get to, you know, typing a whole, you know, dissertation on Facebook. You know, process your feelings about it. Talk to someone about it, because this may be new for you. So I think, you know, I think people are like, I have to say something now, but just, it's okay to process that. You know, there are still people who haven't spoken out about it, and that's okay. You know, people are dealing with this in different ways. And that's why I was saying, like, social media, just because someone didn't post on social media doesn't mean they don't care. They might be processing it in a different way. But I think that we need to be honest about, okay, I'm a white person, I don't understand. Just be honest. I don't understand. And I'm not going to try to offer a solution if I don't understand. That's another thing too. Some people try to offer all these solutions and they have no idea what they're talking about. And I'm like, yeah, no, that's not going to work. Sorry. That's not it. But I appreciate you. And I think as someone who is a person of color, acknowledging that they are trying. Because if we just attack them and say, oh my God, that is so wrong. How could you think that that's a solution to the problem? I think that we have to at least acknowledge that they're trying and showing effort. And then you have to balance this what's happening too, because again, we're still dealing with a pandemic. It's okay to be in the background and help organizations and do your research. Like NAACP is not the only Black organization out there. Do your research on other organizations, but it's just with anything. If we can research, fact check what politicians are saying, we can fact check what's going on with everything else too.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about going back to the language a little bit. Angela Davis said, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. So when people say that I am not racist, or I don't see color, I'm colorblind, I raise my children to be colorblind, can you unpack how does that make you and people, from the Black community that you've spoken with, how does that make you feel? How do you respond to that? I'll tell you from my perspective as an Asian American woman that when I hear people say that I'm colorblind, and I am guilty of this when I was younger too. I used to say that I think that all people should be treated equally. I still believe that, but saying that you're colorblind doesn't mean that you're treating people equally necessarily.
Right.
And when I think about when people say, well, if Black lives matter, well, all lives matter. To me, the goal is that if you're not identifying how you are part of the problem and being against the problem, you are so complicit in the problem, right?
Absolutely.
So can you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you are making a statement like that, you're ignoring the problem. Because just like, if you're rich, if you're a rich person and you can't relate to what's going on with the poor, you can't relate to it. And so you just ignore it. It's not affecting you. So why would you take actionable steps to fix the problem? And so it's the same with racism. It's almost like it's an oblivious mindset to dealing with a problem. It's like, no, we live in a utopia. I've never seen any racism. I never, and I went to a predominantly white college in Maine, and I'm from Chicago. Now, when I was in Chicago, it's pretty much Black, white, other. No one's breaking down all the different groups, you're West Indian, Caribbean, blah, blah, blah. No one's really doing that. I mean, there are those groups, but from the city, the perspective, like how people identify, you're Black, white, or other. Well, when I went to school in Maine, there weren't a lot of Black people, but the very few Black people that we had there it was so many different groups. We divided in so many different groups. So it was the Black Americans, it was the Cape Verdeans, the West Indians, the Africans. And I'm like, it's like 30 of us on campus. Are you serious? Are you all really, breaking each other down to these groups? And so I can't get with, living in a colorblind society, because we don't live in a colorblind society. And yeah, we all bleed red, because you hear that one too. We all bleed red, but we are all facing very different problems culturally, economically, and I think we have to look at how those issues are linked as well, because, usually it's classism, then racism, if you really look at things. And so I think when people say that, to respond to your question, it is ignoring the problem. And people don't want to believe that they are a part of something bad. It's kind of like, oh, I have to look in the mirror. I have to address these problems. And like when people say, oh, well, yeah, she's one of the good white people. That's a microaggression too. That's not right, because you are undermining the efforts of a white person that does want to help, that does want to do something about it. So it's just like, some other microaggressions that I had is, when people say you're so articulate, you're so well spoken. Well, what am I supposed to sound like? Why? And you only hear this. You never hear anyone tell a white person that they're well spoken. Have you ever? And so I've never heard it. Or, people getting projects at work. Well, because we need an urban perspective. What? Like, why? Oh, so because I'm Black, I need to work on this project. Or we want to hire more diverse people, but we don't get any good applicants. Really? So let me see who's applied. Let's see who's applied. Or we don't know where to find any good applicants. I've especially heard that right now. Where can I find some good Black applicants? Are you kidding me? One, there are how many HBCUs in the United States and Black applicants have applied, or people of color have applied. They just don't get hired. And that's another issue, why there's that discrepancy there, but that's a longer conversation. Or even like another example of a microaggression is you have two Black people that work at the same company, and you keep confusing the people. Oh, that's, and I'm like, no, I'm Joy. Just in case.
Oh, girl, I hear it all the time. We all look alike, right? This is
exactly. We all look alike. So, but we don't live in a colorblind society. That's the reality. And we have to, going back to that educational piece, because if you think about it, Grace, what we're taught in school, we're not taught about everyone else. What I was taught at home was about everyone else. And also what's happening during this movement, even amongst Blacks and Latinos, is Latinos don't think this is their fight either. And I'm not saying all, but I've had this conversation. And so this is another thing that's happening too. And I'm like, you do realize we all came from Africa. Like, my father's side is from Puerto Rico, and how do you think Puerto Ricans were made? We came from Africa, Portugal, Africa, Spain. Like, this is, if we all, including white people, Asians, everybody, we go back to our roots, it is from Africa. It might have been, diluted along the lines by the Spanish and the British and all that stuff, but you have to look at the history. And so I think that, that's happening too. There's a division happening there as well with Black and Latina. And you have people who want to use Afro-Latina because it sounds sexy. But then when there's Black Lives Matter, then all of a sudden they're separate from it. And so that's something that I'm seeing as well. And I've been having conversations with some of my friends who are like from the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico. And, and so it's just, it's just bad.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because I remember when everything happened with George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, and there's so many names, unfortunately. That before that, when the coronavirus hit, and there was a spike, a drastic rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans were saying, well, how come no one's speaking out for us? And, and the same thing when there was, people were saying build a wall and deport them all from the Hispanic and Latinx community. It's also, where are they for us? And this idea of, for me, I see it as divide and conquer, right? So the people in power will allow that to happen. And the people who are not aware of that, of this strategy, of that, the more that we fight among each other versus finding commonality to work together, the better it is for the people who are in power to stay in power. And so I really want to unpack some of the language too, that you mentioned urban, they need an urban perspective, and some of the language that people use, not to police language, because I think that people are entitled to, I believe, people are entitled to free speech, but really understanding what people mean when they say things is also important, because when people in positions of power use certain language to mean a certain thing, should that person be making decisions for a diverse community, especially in, a city as diverse as Houston? And some of that language is, using urban when they mean Black people, or saying illegals, when they're trying to refer to Hispanic and Latinx people, or they're talking about one group of protesters as patriots, right? If they're waving the Confederate flag, they believe in their history and they are patriots, versus the other protesters from Black Lives Matter and calling them thugs. This idea of what kind of language, are people using to show, when you're talking about negative language is bad, they're using negative language when people of color do something, and a different kind of language that's positive when white people do something. With the idea, it's the same thing with the monuments that are happening right now, right? So people are saying they shouldn't be taking down these statues. We should be remembering history and all of these things. But when you think about the context in that, a lot of those statues were actually put up after the Civil War, during the Jim Crow era, and all of those things. And then there's somebody who took down a statue of Frederick Douglass, right? And they were vandalizing that because we're saying, if we're going to take down statues, well, then let's take them all down. I think people just, it's not, there's a danger of polarizing, and there's a danger of making enemies where we don't have to make enemies.
Right.
So understanding the meaning, the intention behind what people are saying and doing, and helping other people understand those hidden meanings for people of color, especially because some people don't understand that, well, if I said urban, I meant urban, versus, for a Black person, they, because this is the language has been used against them for a very long time. When you talk about urban crime or something like that, urban poverty, this is what they understand, that these hidden meanings that are in that coded language. And we how do we move forward from that? That's one of the things I'd love to hear your perspective on, is how do we move forward? How do we help other people become better allies with all of that in mind?
Right. I think, and it's the same too with criminals, how, when a white person commits a crime, it's mental health. But when a Black person or a person of color commits a crime, then they knew what they were doing. This was a heinous act, and, they need to go to jail. So in terms of language, I think, again, it goes back to that education piece, because, and especially sometimes we know when we're saying something that is wrong, and we need to be more diligent about course correcting. And if you don't know that it's wrong, then you need to surround yourself with a diverse group of friends that will tell you it's wrong. And that's the thing too, like, look at your friend circle, look at the people around you. Are you living what the world should look like, or are you living in your own bubble? And why? Ask yourself why that is the case if you do not have a diverse group of friends, because we all have to challenge one another to have uncomfortable conversations. I've had some very uncomfortable conversations during this time, a lot of them that I did not want to have. But I realized that if I don't say anything, then my white counterparts or whoever else is going to say something that they shouldn't be saying. And I could have prevented that by having a conversation. I could have recommended some books. I could have, The Help is not what you all should be watching right now on Netflix. Okay. That is not, that is not it right now. Yeah. So that is not a good representation of where the direction we're trying to go. So, and I can recommend some things later, but I think that we need to approach, let me see how to back this up. We need to approach things in terms of creating an equitable environment, because I think sometimes we overthink like, oh, well, what does this Black person want? There was I can't remember what company, but for Black History Month, she called all the Black people into her office and asked them, what should we do for Black History Month? And I was like, are you kidding me? Like that has to be so uncomfortable to go into the CEO's office and say, hey, what do you guys think we should do for Black History Month? Why don't you Google some activities? How about that? Don't put me in a position where I have to speak. And so I think that having inclusive conversations, because if we isolate, I think if we're trying to target this one problem, we're isolating the bigger problem. So when I say that is like, okay, Black people, right? We're talking about Black Lives Matter and things of that nature, but we have to look at the system overall. And to answer your question about should people like that be in leadership? Absolutely not, because they don't understand the bigger problem. They're contributing to the problem by using that language. One person who has a lot of power can incite hate on so many different levels. I mean, and if that person has influence, enough influence, and people listen to them, they only have to say it once, and people will follow. And I mean, look at celebrities. If a celebrity said they use one product, that product will be sold out the next day or the day of. And so I think it's using our influence for good, not for bad. But in terms of the language, I think, again, I keep going back to this education piece, because I was taught when I was younger that certain racial slurs were not okay, that certain nursery rhymes were linked to lynching and so many other horrible things that happened to slaves. Like, so pick up a book, Google something, Google whatever it is. And I know that we can't always go to Google because you may not even know where to start. But I challenge people to, if your network is not diverse, to expand your network so you can have challenging conversations with people. But if something doesn't sound right, if something doesn't feel right, it probably isn't right. And so there are terms, I know you all sent well, and I hope Michelle will send the glossary of terms out to people, but educating yourself on what different terms mean, because diversity is different from equity, and equity is different from inclusion. Racism is different from discrimination, and discrimination, so we have to look at what these different things mean, because some of these things are used very loosely, and we have to understand exactly what those words mean as well.
Yeah, I thinking about how can people help, right? You were talking about, people know what they mean when they say something, because they know their intent. And for those who don't, I think showing up in places where you are the only in the room will help you understand, especially if you come with a genuine intent to learn and to make those diverse friends. One of the reasons why I know Philip, our board chair, for instance, was I looked for community partners for the different organizations that I work with, and looked up the NAACP, looked up the Urban League, and whether there were chapters in Houston, and showed up at events and just got to know the people and to see who wants to work with me. So I think for anybody who is from a different community than the communities that they want to build relationships with, like you said, you can Google, you can look for Black Chamber of Commerce, Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, Asian Chamber of Commerce, and they all exist, and show up, and you'll inevitably meet there's an LGBT Chamber of Commerce, right? Anybody that you meet, just find out who will talk to you. And if you come with a genuine, authentic willingness to learn, and you want to build bridges, people feel that, and they really do feel that. There's another thing that I found that I thought would be really helpful, and I'll put it in the chat here, and we can add it to the email afterwards. On our website, it's resistance bingo. I like making it fun because this is such a heavy topic and conversation that sometimes some people just want somebody else to tell me something to do. And you mentioned some of them earlier, like donate to an organization, register to vote. There's one bingo card that I'm looking at that says promote an event, offer your home as a sanctuary space, or make space, for these types of conversations. There are so many things you can do. But I think just sometimes people, like you said, don't know where to look and don't know what terms to Google for. I do want to go, Simi in the chat had asked, how can small businesses best support communities of color? And should it be specific to the industry of the company? Should it be sponsorship of community events? Because you'd like to show solidarity. So do you have some recommendations?
Yeah, I think partnering with certain community organizations that support people of color. So for example, like you mentioned, Houston Urban League, there are lots of nonprofits that are trying to drive forward equitable change in Houston and beyond, not just in Houston, but they're a national organization. So yeah, being a partner, sponsoring an event. I know NAPBAR, for example, they do Wellness Wednesdays. So sponsoring a Wellness Wednesdays, or, let's see, offering to be a mentor for, like, I work with an organization called Divink, for example, offering to be a mentor, because that's another thing too, in terms of communities of color, the access to resources that, white people have, they're not there. So lending your support as a mentor, as an advocate in those communities would be invaluable. Yeah.
I would add that there are 3 C's that I think about whenever somebody from the business community wants to support communities of color, and that's contracts. Make sure that if you have a business, find entrepreneurs of color or startups led by people of color and give them contracts, or customers. Help them get customers or be a customer of businesses that are owned or led by people of color and women and LGBT, and people from basically, overlooked groups. And then finally, capital. If you can invest in a company, and you don't have to be an angel investor or with a VC fund, you can also look on Nextseed or look at crowdfunding platforms. So yeah, nextseed.com is a crowdfunding platform, but look at entrepreneurs of color who are crowdfunding, and then just give, small amounts. You don't have to give $100,000. $100 is helpful, especially for somebody who is just starting their business. So yeah, going back, capital, contracts, customers. And then there's another question from Flavia. How can change be led within especially small organizations when there is no HR department and there's a pretty flat hierarchy? How do we make sure that the willingness is not something that stays in words and promises, but actually acted upon, and making sure that it's not a burden on BIPOC or Black, Indigenous, and people of color?
That's a great question. I think we have to change how diversity and inclusion is viewed in organizations. Right now, it's kind of something that's obligatory. You have to tolerate it. We're pushing it down people's throats. It has to be something that people want to do. People should want to be inclusive. They should want diverse employees. They should want that culture. And so I think that we have to change the narrative of diversity and inclusion and not make it seem like it's just something we just absolutely have to do. And that comes from creating a culture, that comes from leadership. But I think when we don't have an environment that is conducive to our employees, we have to hold leadership accountable. That's the biggest thing. And, whoever the executive director, managing partner, if there's not an HR partner, having a conversation. One of the things that I do with staff is having weekly one-on-ones, because that's a safe space to provide feedback, catch up on, existing tasks, have a conversation, have an open door approach. Because in those meetings, and they don't have to be long, it can be 15 minutes, you need to just create a safe space for people to say, I feel like we need to do some group activities. We need to have a focus group around this topic, or whatever the case may be. But having those conversations with leadership, because if I don't feel welcome, you're going to know about it. And that's just me. Everybody's not like that. But there are ways, there are diplomatic ways to go about it. And just, I think, starting that conversation is one of the biggest things, and holding people accountable. If there's leadership, like you said, there's no HR department, just saying, hey, I was thinking these are some of the ways we can promote diversity, or we can create a more inclusive environment, and offering suggestions to do that. A lot of that can start with team building exercises. from a leadership standpoint. If your leadership feels detached from your team or your staff, team building exercises will bring out all the good, bad, and ugly. You can get to the bottom of those things. Have a real open forum about those things.
Yeah, I think what you said about safety is really important. Creating psychologically safe spaces, basically, for people to share what they're going through, and then also ask really tough questions is important, right? And being open, especially if you're the perceived leader within the group. So let's say if there is a flat hierarchy, there's no HR, but people look to you to help lead the culture, or to help them get direction in terms of the mission and morality. Leading by example, basically, right? And saying these are the things that we won't accept is also important. In addition to the things that you want to increase, like inclusion and equity, saying the things that you won't do. And one of the things that we did with Impact Hub Houston, we actually have a post on our website where we talked about our commitment. So in addition to, one of the things that was irritating to me was when all of these corporations came out and they made statements about how they stand by Black Lives Matter, and yet a lot of their actions over the years have not shown that they care about Black lives. But we had, Michelle and I were talking about this because we believe that our actions would speak for us. But then it seems like it became important that we actually verbalize those things and write them down, because then people can see where we stand versus assuming that they can interpret it correctly, right? And one of the things that we talked about in our commitment is not just saying that we are against bigotry, but also we will divest from partnerships and projects that perpetuate institutionalized discrimination, because saying that we won't work with people like that is just as important as saying that we will work with people who are committed to inclusion. Because for people who are just becoming woke and saying that, okay, now we're going to work towards inclusion and equity, well, we can't tell if you're genuine about it, going, back to what you were saying earlier, or you're just saying it because it's the trend right now. Right. And then, thinking about what's performative versus what is going to really address systemic and generational change is going to take some time. So this is a long view kind of, long-term strategy of how do we change the system towards a more inclusive and equitable system, and not just these patches here and there. It's going to take everyone within an organization. And if you have a flat hierarchy, it's going to make sure that everybody in that organization or in your organization is committed to that vision, and what you're going to do and what you're not going to do.
And I think it's important that as an organization, everyone understands, like, here's our mission. This is why you work here. And this is what we are about. Like, and that mission should include, some sort of solidarity, some sort of unity. What are we here for? Some people might be there to collect a check, but when something is mission driven, I think it's easier to develop a culture around that, and saying, like, listen, guys, this is not something that should be tolerated. Look at the person next to you. Understand what their plight is. It could be age, it could be race, it could be gender, sexual orientation. Understand who you are sitting next to, because at the end of the day, we all have our struggles. But how can we be better together? I saw Kalia had put hashtag better together. Yeah, like, how can we be better together? How can we move forward and change the narrative? Because a strong organization is unstoppable. And if we trickle that down into the communities and other organizations that we work with, we're a force to be reckoned with. And so we have to keep the momentum going. And that's one of the things that, as part of allyship, this is not a one-time thing. You don't just pop out an email and say, all right, I've done my part. I support everybody. I support Black Lives Matter. I made my donation. Now I'm going to go to bed. This is not a one-time thing. This is ongoing. We are living this every day. It's not an option for us to turn it off. I wish I could, but we're living this every day. And so this is an ongoing fight, and we have to keep the momentum going, because it's just like when protests die down, and it's like not until somebody else is dead does, do we get back on the bandwagon? So we have to keep this going.
Yeah,
And you know, I saw Verena had a question too, but
yeah, that's what I was going to move to. But I just wanted to wrap up with what you were just saying, that this isn't the first time we've heard "I can't breathe," right? Eric Garner happened too,
yeah.
and it's just like it does take a long-term commitment to changing the system. So Verena and Krista both were talking about how they're facilitating a book club for people to read White Fragility and How to Be an Anti-Racist, with open space for people to discuss their internalized racism. Does that work if I'm white and learning, or should I find a person of color to facilitate? What do you
It
think?
absolutely works if you're white. Do it, you know, and that makes more sense, actually. So I was on, Kalia actually did a Wellness Wednesdays on White Fragility today, and there was a white speaker. I totally think you should go for it because you can draw in a different audience. And I think that it's important to educate people who look like you and who don't look like you. Because I'll tell you, there are a lot of people of color, there are a lot of Black people who haven't even read White Fragility. So I think, yeah, you could totally facilitate it. And if you need help with like discussion questions, there are guides for that as well to help you facilitate the discussions and get people, you know, really talking in terms of, you know, things to bring out of people with that book, because there's a lot.
Yeah, I think it's important that Verena, you and Krista are also holding space for this, because I mentioned Philip earlier. So Philip Yates is our board chair. He's a Black man, and he said that, you know, when we first talked about doing core conversations, I said, you know, can you reach out to people in your community, in the Black community, maybe somebody from the Urban League or from NAACP who would like to host these conversations, and we can support and promote it. And he said, no, you should do it. Like, this is something that you should do because people outside of the community need to be talking about it, right? Because we've been talking about it for a long time. Like, people in the Black community have been talking about this issue for a really long time, and it's time that other people start talking about it and inviting us, because, you know, it's really important to provide a platform for other people within, you know, other communities.
I think in inviting, though, because I saw that Krista said she was having a hard time, you know, with having people of color join. When inviting or trying to invite people of color to a conversation, do not make it seem like, and I'm not saying you're doing this, Krista, but I'm just saying in general, do not make it seem like, you know, I'm the great white hope, I'm the savior, I'm all of a sudden jumping on the Black bandwagon or whatever, trying to save people of color. Make sure it's just, I want to have a conversation about this. I really want to have a conversation about this, and not in a way that's like, I want to know how I can help. You know, I want to, you know, just.
Yeah, it's not social justice over lattes, right?
That's another example of kind of like the language. Let's just be careful. Don't come off as the, you know, as the savior, because that is the last thing. That is the last thing you want to do.
Yeah. Thank you. And if we're at time, but Michelle had one more question, and I hope, you know, if you all are willing to stay, if you have to go, that's okay. But she said she would like to hear your perspective for the young professional, especially those who recently entered the workforce. And she's heard questions on this from recent college grads who don't know how to bring up the conversation for fear of how it will impact their career trajectory.
Right. That's a good
professionals.
Oh man, that's tough, you know, because I don't encourage everyone to be as radical as I am. But I do encourage people to speak out. And again, I think corporations are definitely set up a lot better now than they were before in terms of how you can have a conversation with a manager. A lot of people are doing mentor programs, and you need to align yourself with someone that will be an ally. And when I say ally, someone that will support you personally and professionally. Because once you build that relationship, then you have someone that will be an advocate for you. It's hard to fight at the corporate level when you don't have an advocate for you, especially someone that's not in the high place. If you're talking to the intern next to you, both of you all are fighting this battle and no one's listening to you, no one cares, you're indispensable. You're not indispensable. So I think that make sure you have an ally, and then you can have those conversations, and make sure when you start, just let your manager know, like, hey, this is how I best learn. this is how I best take in information, and this is how I would like to see this relationship work. Can we set up a weekly meeting where I can offer feedback? We can check in. It doesn't have to be long, but just so we are on the same page. And this is an opportunity for us to talk about any concerns I may have. But I really like it if we can have an open door approach for me in order for me to grow here. Because I see this as a company, because people love to hear about themselves. I see this as a company that really supports growth and whatever the mission of the company is. And this is a place I see myself growing, but this is what I need in order to thrive. That's a diplomatic way. That's the nice way.
Thank you. That was really great. For anybody who's interested in learning more, I would recommend looking up sponsorship versus mentorship, because what Joy is talking about is really finding someone to sponsor you within, a corporation.
Mm-hmm.
And then let's see. I think it's changed too. So to your question, Michelle, from my perspective, I'm a Gen Xer, and my approach and my peers, our approach initially was just do whatever it takes to get your foot in the door. And then once you're in, try to change it from within. But, for millennials and Zoomers or Gen Z now, I think that the culture has changed enough where you can hold companies a little more accountable and ask them, what are you doing in terms of supporting leadership pipelines, paths for people of color or for women, right? And act as if you are interviewing them, because it's going to be their privilege if you decide to work with them, especially for people of color, because I don't know if you've seen this, Joy, but I've definitely seen it where people are trying to hire more, minorities and women to fill whatever they need, whether it's quotas or just diversity targets.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
kind of like I said earlier, we need someone to work on this project. So we need a Black person, or we need a Latino person. Like, I've literally worked on contracts, or I've gotten contracts because they needed to show that they had a diverse staff. They needed someone specifically Black, and they needed someone that spoke Spanish. And, so I only got picked for that contract because of who I was. And I'm like, I'll take the money, but we're going to have a conversation about it.
You were qualified, Joy. You were qualified, because that is something I want to correct. What I hear people say, when we talk about affirmative action, because this is a contentious issue within the Asian American community of where should we stand on affirmative action, because it limits the number of Asian Americans that can get into to colleges, for instance. That the idea that somebody is hiring you just because you're Black is untrue. Right.
Oh yeah, I know.
You are qualified. Yeah, exactly. And then
bonus.
Exactly. That's an added bonus. Yeah.
Right.
When people say that she was just hired because she's Black, or because she was Asian, or because she's a woman, that's completely, yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I know. I was in this particular case, I was there because I had the skills, plus I was Black and spoke Spanish. But yeah, no, that is true. People will definitely undermine themselves because of the race factor, but when it may not be the case.
Okay, well, we're at time, a little over time, but thank you so much, Michelle. Thank you, Joy, for joining us. If you have a closing remark before we take our photo.
Yes, no, just want to thank you all so much for all the insight that you shared. And I definitely learned a lot, and I hope everyone else on this group did as well. Please stay connected with Impact Hub Houston, either through our social media platforms, or I also commented in the chat, you can be part of our local community app on houimpact.com. You can create a profile there and connect with everybody that's in our conversation today. And we will have a follow-up event next Wednesday with another guest speaker to continue this conversation, but from a different lens. So thank you all so much.